Section 3, Chapter 7. Just as every prisoner has a getting caught story, every prisoner but the lifers and the executed eventually has a getting out story. Most of the stories are pretty routine. A man does his time, keeps his nose clean, doesn't get in trouble, and is released when either his sentence runs out or the parole board gives him a date. But some of the getting out stories are escape stories, mostly attempted escape stories. When I was at West Street, I saw an escape attempt straight out of Bugs Bunny cartoon. 3 guys had ripped bed sheets and strips and then braided them into a rope. There was an exercise period on the roof, and because it was cold, we wore big army jackets. When it came time for the escape, one guy wound the rope around and around himself and put it on the biggest coat he could find. There was a guard tower on the roof and fence. 2 other accomplices faked a fight and drew the guard's attention while the escapee unwound the rope and threw it over the fence and down. He tied the end to the fence pole and climbed up over. The second escapee climbed up and over. The third, but the bed sheet couldn't hold all their weight and it snapped. All 3 of them fell about 4 stories. None of them died, but they all ended up in the hospital. I met a young guy named Quentin, who was only a kid, who was an okay kid. He always came off tougher than he was. He was being transferred from a minimum security prison for a court appearance. Some new charges had been filed against him, and he was worried. Too worried to go before a judge again. Since he had minimum security status, he wasn't handcuffed, and as the guard drove past a cornfield, Quentin flipped open his door and bailed out. He hit the road a few times, then hopped up and ran into the field. The guard stopped the car and hollered him to come back, and he promised he wouldn't tell anyone that he tried to escape. Just come back and all would be forgiven. But Quentin knew the future charges against him were true, and he was crashing through the corn and looking for a way out. He came to the farmhouse, forced open the basement window, and hid in the coal bin for 2 days. On Sunday, the farmer and his wife went to church, and Quentin went upstairs, found a set of car keys, and took off in a pickup truck. And a few days later, as he stepped out of a grocery store, he was picked up. The truck had been spotted and traced. He never changed the plate. A group of guys started an astral projection circle where they would sit around a card table and concentrate on breaking down all their molecules into subatomic material and drifting through the fence. That was a waste of time. They went nowhere. Other guys would get furloughs and not return, but were eventually caught. Some guys were on work release and would walk off the job, but they were always caught. It was always something dumb, like they saw a car with the keys in the ignition and then they went into a bar and got loaded and just decided not to return. Nothing remarkable. There were no daring helicopter rescues, no tunnels, no ingenious plans to dress up as a guard and stroll out the front door. Most often, the escape attempts were straightforward and totally ineffective. But despite cons like the X-ray tech before me tried to get away. Tried anyways. The fence was 12 feet high and triple row of razor wires on the top, and if you made it over that fence, there was a second identical fence to get over, and there were guard towers with snipers and bloodhounds in their kennels just waiting to sniff you out. But in the dozen or so attempts I saw or heard about, not one man ever made it over the first fence. Still, after the parole board set me off, my mind wandered towards escape plans. I imagined the usual plots: a helicopter rescue, a tunnel, a paperwork snafu, and mistaken release. Escape became a mental parlor game, and then I stumbled across a plan that would work. I knew a lot of draft dodgers who spent time hiding out in Canada, and I figured I could too. After I had received my minimum security custody rating from my caseworker, Mr. Beau offered to take me out on an evening furlough to a special motel where you can get your rocks off. And all I had to do was to have fun and be back by midnight. Cinderella rules. Only I wouldn't come back. Before going, I could raise the cash inside by selling medical supplies. I could check flight schedules and make a reservation by using Mr. Beau's office phone when I mopped his floors on the weekend. And once he dropped me off at the motel, I could cab it to the airport, catch a flight to Canada, and be over the border before I was missed. I knew it would work. It was simple and it was tempting, but being a fugitive for life was too much of a risk. Yes, it was delicious to imagine. My real getting out story was nothing like the one I had imagined. First and foremost, I got a new caseworker, Mr. Wilcox, retired, and I was assigned Mr. Casey. He was young and was not yet beaten down by the brutal atmosphere and frustration of trying to help people in pretty hopeless situations. So I tried one more long shot. I went to him and I told him I wanted to go to college and that if I got accepted to one while I still was in prison, did he think I could persuade the parole board into giving me an early release to go to school? I never heard of an escape plan like that before, he said. If you get accepted to a school, I'll write a special progress report and we'll give it a try. That was all the hope that I needed to get me fired up. I went down to the library and asked the librarian if they had Barron's Guide to Colleges, and they didn't. So I went to Mr. Bowe's office and I asked him to buy me one. I told him I'd pay him back somehow, but for now I just needed the book. The next day, he brought one in. We pored over it. Okay, I said, I want to go to the school with a writing program, but I don't have any writing. So let's find a school, any school that has low standards, and I'll offer them cash. We flipped through the pages and found a small school in New York, Graham Junior College. It was a 2-year school with a focus on communication arts. Their motto was, learn by doing. Sounded fine by me. I sent away for an application, and I had Mr. Casey mail my request from his house to the envelope, so the envelope would not be stamped with the U.S. Department of Corrections, like all outbound prison mail is. I used his address for the return. Soon they responded, and I filled out the application. And in my cover letter, I made it extremely clear to them that I was not applying for financial aid, that I was 100% cash-paying student. I figured that would speak louder than my mediocre transcripts from Sunrise High School. I also told them that I would like to enroll as a student as soon as possible in mid-year January semester. I spent days crafting my answers to a few short essay questions. My caseworker and I decided, since the application didn't ask about arrest or anything like that, no point in bringing it up the subject myself, as it would probably spoil my chances. Mr. Casey typed up the application, wrote a check for the application fee, and sent it back to them. A few very slow weeks passed, and Mr. Casey called me into his office. He had the reply from the college, and I ripped the envelope open, and I was accepted. I gave it to Mr. Casey, and he read it. Impressive, he said, and he was true to his word. He wrote out a special progress report to my achievements in the prison. He attached a copy of the college acceptance letter, and he sent it to the parole board for consideration. This was the real college application. I waited. It was nerve-wracking. My face broke out again. Welts, boils, acne, reservoirs of pus and blood. But this time, I left my face alone. I did hundreds of sit-ups. I did push-ups. I sweated it out. Finally, Mr. Casey received a report from the parole board. He ran up the x-ray room to give me the news, and I had a date, December 18th. I was stunned. Nearly 15 months after my first night at West Street, I would be released. I read the letter over and over. There were conditions. I had to have a stable place to live in New York City and a job, and I had neither. And right away, I was nervous. Mr. Casey let me call my father. I explained what I needed. A week later, he called Mr. Casey. He knew a guy in St. Croix whose mother had an extra room in an apartment in Little Italy. I could live there and pay her rent. The same guy had a brother who would give me a job selling Christmas trees, and I could find a steady job after the holiday. Casey called in the information to the parole board, and my release was approved, and I was given my walking papers.